Shabbat Shalom to everyone. Once again, happy Chanukah. Hope that there is joy and celebration to be found. Perhaps some Zoom Chanukah lightings. And maybe you're joining us for our congregational lighting, a nice Zoom event each night of the holiday. So I promised you an Israel story before the prayer for the state of Israel. And I happened to come across a great only in Israel story that showed up in my Twitter feed this week. A couple was getting engaged in what they thought was a secluded spot in what amounts to Israel's, one second, please. It's a speaker issue somewhere. So a couple was getting engaged in what they thought was a secluded spot. We just have a technical issue here in the sanctuary, just a second. So once again, a couple was getting engaged in what they thought was a secluded spot in what amounts to Israel's countryside. So whether for romantic or privacy purposes, they also chose to stroll in this tree and shrub-filled area at night. After he popped the question and she said yes, out of the bushes emerged a small squad of IDF soldiers with some high-tech equipment in tow. I'm not sure if they said Mazel Tov, but they did say, we saw you were getting engaged and we were working with some new thermal imaging technology and we got some pictures of you. Would you like to have them? It seems that lighting up the night is not just a Chanukah theme in Israel, but a militarily significant one as well. I also saw a fundraiser for a Support the Troops of the IDF organization. I honestly don't remember which one. There are several good ones. Referring to them as our modern Maccabees. I'm all for supporting the brave soldiers of the IDF in prayer, word, thought, and helping to supply anything they need to make their job a little easier or their lives a little more comfortable. And I understand why they were referred to as modern Maccabees. The soldiers of old were the protagonists of our original few against the many, weaker against the stronger efforts, blessed by God fighters for what was right and good and Jewish. When it comes to the modern day IDF, thankfully, weaker against the stronger no longer applies. And as a result of exceptional technological and intelligence gathering advantages, their relatively smaller size and numbers is more than made up for by their know-how and pinpoint accuracy. The Maccabees were a religious army fighting for a religious agenda. As you know, the IDF has religious and non-religious soldiers whose loyalty is to the state and has no desire or agenda to impose Jewish practices on anybody. Their love and commitment is to country, land, and all of Israel's citizens. In our History of Zionism class, we were reminded that the first thing the Israeli government did after soldiers unexpectedly captured the Old City and the Temple Mount in 1967 was to decide to not take possession of or even administer the Temple Mount, but to turn it over to the Muslim Waqf. It is hard to imagine that a religious army with religious goals and motivation would even consider such a thing. Modern Maccabees? Kind of yes, kind of no. In fighting with religious motivation and with a desire to impose religious policy? No. In the unexpected victory over supposedly mightier and certainly more numerous forces? Yes. That is where the modern Maccabee label comes from, and why for some it continues to stick. While in Israel it is common to recognize and even emphasize the miracle of the military victory, for a long time that narrative was carefully de-emphasized. And perhaps you know or can imagine why. The Talmud plays it down as it describes in very little detail the origins of the practices and customs of the holiday we are now celebrating. You almost get the sense that they were not very big fans of it, in part because they presented in what amounts to a tangent in their exploration of the laws of Shabbat. The more famous reason for this is that they did not like what the descendants of the Hasmonean and Maccabees did later on. They combined the priesthood and the kingship, which was a no-no. Ironically, they became massively corrupt, both in the economic and the religious sphere, up to and including buying the priesthood and installing high priests with obviously Greek names. Maybe it's not fair to hold the ancestors responsible for all the sins of their descendants. But that is indeed not the only reason the rabbis of the Talmud chose to gloss over the achievement of this early Jewish army. So what was the other, less famous reason? Well, think about when the rabbis did their work, especially in Israel. Greece had been replaced by Rome. The state had fallen long ago. Rome did not abide rebellions. Hearing even an inkling or rumor of one would be met with the harshest of consequences. The rabbis of the early rabbinic period were trying to rebuild Judaism just a few generations after the destruction of the temple. They could ill afford another smashing at the hands of a foreign enemy. So teaching too much about or emphasizing a holiday that celebrated just such a military rebellion against an occupying power might have tripped the sensibilities of the Roman authorities, and disaster may have ensued. So, and this sounds flip, but it is really not, the rabbis looked around for another Chanukah miracle, and lo and behold, they found the story of the oil, enough for one day that lasted 8. Maybe this was an oral tradition passed down from the era of the Maccabees. Maybe the rabbis adapted it from a different source and applied it to Chanukah. Maybe they came up with it themselves as part of their imaginative midrashic capabilities. Either way, this story does not appear in any source until the Babylonian Talmud, which was compiled in the 5th century CE, some 700 years after the events of Chanukah took place. It doesn't really matter where this narrative came from, because this story is not an account of history. It is a statement of their lived and their aspirational truth. God is with us. Judaism will survive until it can thrive. And a seemingly small act of dedication can have larger than anticipated effect and also consequences. So keep lighting lights, keep the flame alive, and one day, we or our descendants will again reside safely and at peace in our own land. They did not think it would be a 2,000-year wait, and for a people not known for our patience, we had to be very patient indeed. Chanukah recognizes that dedication, in addition to all of its other associations that have made it the most widely observed Jewish holiday on the calendar. Jewish military might has come and gone and come again, but continuity of the Jewish spirit is the key to our longevity. This is an idea, as you heard, that is reflected in today's Haftarah. It is likely the most famous thing the prophet Zechariah ever said, and he can thank Debbie Friedman in part for that, for setting his words to catchy music. Not by might and not by power, but by my Spirit alone. And I'll return to that verse in just a moment. Thursday, some of you are on the Zoom memorial for and tribute to Rabbi Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory. There were some 14 presenters, a mix of rabbis, Jewish educators, and lay people, and each presented a favorite text from the writings of the former chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth. The recording is available if you'd like to give yourself a wonderful and free Chanukah present. Just email the office for the link or check B'nai Torah's ever-expanding YouTube page. I presented his take on Parshat Pekudei, and it's really beautiful. In case there was time, which there wasn't, I was also prepared with some quotes from his commentary on Parshat Bishalach. And wouldn't you know it, in it there is a Chanukah connection. You remember that when the Israelites fought Amalek, soon after they left Egypt, Moses, standing on a nearby hilltop, had to hold his arms up, or his assistants would help him to do so. When his arms were up toward heaven, the Israelite troops would win. When they were down, they would fail. Was this a miracle? Rabbi Sacks says no, at least not in the supernatural sense. Moses reminded the people that if they look up to the source of their strength, and not down at their own 2 feet alone and inadequate, they could rise to the occasion and they would succeed. To illustrate this point about how important it is to look up, Rabbi Sacks tells the story of an amateur archaeologist who for years was digging in a cave for artifacts. One day he brought his 9-year-old daughter with him, and she wandered deeper into the cave and to her amazement saw something on the wall above her. "Look, Papa, oxen," she said. They were, in fact, bison. She had made one of the great discoveries of prehistoric art of all time. The drawings were possibly 35,000 years old. In Rabbi Sacks's words, look down at the difficulties and you can give way to despair. The only way to sustain energies, individual or collective, is to turn our gaze up towards the far horizon of hope. Want to guess how he finishes that inspired essay? By quoting Zechariah, the same verse as appears in this morning's Haftarah, chosen by the rabbis to encourage all of us to look up to God and a more distant horizon of hope for inspiration, and not to rely too much on looking down the barrel of a rifle or the turret of a tank. Not by might nor by power, but by my Spirit, said the prophet. On which Sacks comments, Jewish history is a sustained set of variations on this theme. A small people that, in the face of difficulty, continues to look up will win great victories and achieve great things. There are many miracles of Chanukah, an unlikely military victory, an inventive and purposeful midrash about oil that lasted longer than it should have, and a people that has chosen to keep the lamp of its spirit lit for thousands of years in times of blessing and strength, and also in full eras of difficulty, and even in the aftermath of defeat. When you light your Chanukah tonight, look down at the flames for the commitment to Jewish history, tradition, culture, and longevity they represent. And then look up and remember that you and the blessings you have and the blessings you share are also a miracle, sustained by an indomitable Jewish spirit, of which we are each temporary but irreplaceable guardians. Shabbat Shalom and Chag Sameach. Continue with Musaf, which begins